In the last section, we spoke a lot about the Open Weather Data API, and we spoke about the exact nature of the request and the data that we would need to pass to it and the data that we would get back. So in this section, we're going to talk more about how we actually make that request in the first place. Remember, we want to make our request to grab that weather data whenever we get new longitude and latitude coordinates, which is basically whenever the function onRegionChangeComplete is called. That means that this function right here is a really great place to kick off our request. Now, rather than stuffing more logic into this function to make the request though, and all the code that comes around that, we're going to take that code out to a separate file. We're going to do that just to keep our view logic inside this component nice and clean. And it also means that we can reuse that request in the future by other components if we so chose. So to that end, I'm going to create a new folder, and we're just going to call it SRC. Inside of SRC, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it api.js. Now remember, our code in separate files is always 100% siloed from other files. So in order to get access to the API code that we're going to write in here from index.ios.js, we need to manually form a link between the two. And this link is formed by module.exports. Whenever we call this function in here, we're definitely going to want to pass it our current latitude and longitude, because this function right here is going to be responsible for actually making the request, and obviously it's going to need to know the current latitude and longitude to form up the correct request. So now it's time to do some heavy lifting. It's time to actually make the request. If you're used to using, say, jQuery's AJAX function, well, that's not going to quite get you too far here. On React Native, we don't really get the benefit of jQuery, and instead we're going to make use of what's called the fetch API. Fetch is a function that takes a URL and some options and then returns, you guessed it, a promise. So let's first define the URL that we're going to retrieve. I'm going to bump my screen size up here just a little bit. So the root URL is going to be the API call that we were just looking at. So I'm going to go back over to Chrome. I'm going to go look at our weather data. I'm going to go back into the current weather data documentation, click More, and then we're going to go to Weather by Geographic Coordinates. I'm going to take basically this entire link right here. So I'm just going to copy the link address, and then I'm going to dump it right inside of this variable right here. We don't want the default latitude and longitude on here though, so we're just going to take that off. But we will leave the question mark at the very end. Now, if you recall, we do have an API key, and that API key needs to be included with every request we make. And that means that we might as well just go ahead and stick that API key into this root URL here. So I'm going to go back over to Open Weather Map. I'm going to go to my member section here, and I've still got my API key. So I'm going to go ahead, select it, copy it, and I'm going to add it with a property app ID equals, and then I'm just going to paste the key. So make sure that your URL is looking something very similar to this right here. This is a very common place to make a little mistake or a little typo. We want to make sure that we have weather question mark app ID equals, and then just the key. All right, so we've got our root URL, and now we just need to add on a query string for the longitude and latitude. Looking back at the API docs, we need a query string that contains the latitude and the longitude. The latitude will just be LAT, and the longitude will be LON. Not, I made this mistake myself, not LONG, just LON, 3 characters. So to make this URL, this final URL, we're going to add a variable, and it's going to be the root URL, and then we're going to add on here, it would be kind of a pain in the rear if we did something like this. This is really what we have to do. We need to add on another parameter. It needs to be lat plus latitude, blah, you know, just like a lot of different string additions in here. Well, that's kind of a pain to type out, and luckily we don't really have to do that anymore thanks to another feature of ES6. So rather than writing out this kind of long string concatenation thing, we're going to make use of a feature called string concatenation. Excuse me, template strings. There we go. So a template string is a string that allows us to inject JavaScript variables directly into a string. All we have to do is write a backtick instead of a quote. So this is not a quote, it's not a double quote, it's a backtick. It's the button on your keyboard to the left of the 1. And then inside of this template string, all we have to do is write a $ and then curly brace if we want to inject a JavaScript variable. So I'm going to do root URL. And then we're going to have and lat equals, and then we want another JavaScript variable. So we'll do $ curly brace latitude and lon equals $. Oh, I made that mistake again. Not long, just lon. And inside the curly braces here, we'll do longitude. So this might look a little bit funky right now, and it certainly is kind of illegible, but the code that we just wrote here is absolutely equal to something that looks like this. Root URL plus lat plus latitude and longitude. So it's totally up to you which direction you want to go with. Between these two options right now, you know, I'm not going to lie. This is actually, the template string actually does look kind of confusing, but it's a good habit to get into because on other projects you might work on, template strings can actually save you a lot of complexity and something that looks kind of otherwise ugly with this you know, string concatenation that we have here. Okay, so we've got our URL formed up, and all we need to do now is make the actual request by using the fetch API. So let's do that in the next section.